I'm watching this and all I can think of is like, we're losing more and more because obviously they're getting older, and
Yeah.
these stories have to be documented. And so I wanted to ask you how David kind of came on your radar and how it all started for you.
Sure. So I actually met the family in nursery school. So it was a long game for this film to be made.
That's a
I
long connection.
It's a long
Absolutely.
connection. Yeah, I went to nursery school with Dove, one of David's grandchildren,
Yeah.
and I knew the family growing up. David's son was my rabbi for my family my whole life,
Yeah.
and I always knew that David was a Holocaust survivor. As I just remembering back from being a kid, and I knew that he sang. And he would sometimes come to our temple and sing at services. So I knew that his singing was how he survived as far as he knew, but I didn't know the details of his story at all until I was a grown up.
Sure.
And then I became a documentary filmmaker. And a few years ago, I went to see Avi and David. They were performing in New York. And I had seen Avi, who's a performer and does concerts. And I'd seen him a few times, but I'd never seen a concert together with the two of
Right.
them. So I went to watch, and it was at a synagogue, and the rabbi who was hosting them introduced them and said, my friend David is here, and I've known him for years, and however many, 20 years before or something like that. Before David really told his story much, he asked David if he could fill in for him one day when the rabbi had to go out of town with his family for a family event. So he said, would you mind leading services for me? And David was like, okay, what do you want me? What should I do for my sermon? And the rabbi said, why don't you tell them how you got into singing? Not knowing the story. Sure. Okay. So the next Monday, the rabbi came back to work, and it was in the days of answering machines, and the red light was just like blinking like crazy. And the rabbi started to listen to his messages. And the first one said, why don't you go out of town more often? And the second one said, I haven't stopped crying since Friday night. So the rabbi went in and said, what did you tell them? And David said, you told them to say why I started singing. So he told his story. And then that night, a few years ago, he told it. And I asked Avi, have you guys considered making a movie? So that's kind of how it came
And
to
there
be.
you go. And there you go. And it's so beautiful to see. I've been following lately, that I've been trying to cover as many of these stories as possible, because like I said earlier, it's just so important to keep these stories going, and generations need to know about them and stuff. But what I always find so interesting is these Holocaust survivors that are still alive. They have such resilience, they have such faith and so much hope. And it just, I don't understand it, to be honest. What kind of surprised you most, I think, about David when you started to get to know him?
So I guess I wouldn't phrase it as a surprise, but what intrigued me. So the reason I was drawn to this story is because I already knew the family.
Right.
And so I know, like, David's son, for example, who's my rabbi, has like a great sense of humor and deals with dark issues through humor. And for me, that's a real draw. And
Right.
so I obviously, of course, if that's the way you respond to things, that's something to do with how you were raised. And so once I got to know David, I knew, okay, so he likes to laugh and he likes music, and that's how he deals with things.
Right.
And for me, the basically all of the editing for this film took place during lockdown, and I found it a really inspiring thing to work on, which is weird to say. A movie about the Holocaust was actually very uplifting to work on during this time, because it was like a prototype of, okay, these are people who survived something unthinkable, and really just the worst things you can imagine, and kept going and kept singing and kept being people, despite seeing the worst of humanity. And so I guess, like, when I went back to film, we were at the 75th anniversary, and it's all these survivors who are there with their kids and grandkids, and they're singing and dancing and celebrating. And I think, you have to find something that keeps you going. And so all the people who made it through did.
100%. No, for sure. There's no question about that. And I was going to ask you about going there with him and seeing all these people and everything. And I think what, just so moved me is when David was taking Avi through the barracks, the bunk that he slept in.
Right.
They found his name like carved. I, how do you shoot stuff like that?
That I wasn't there in that moment of that, but that was a crew that shared some footage with us, and but we filmed other things, of course, at the camp, and where I was in that moment, and it's emotional. I mean, there are a lot of scenes in the film where I'm, in the corner crying, or
Yeah.
or trying, in other moments, trying not to laugh too loud, or like
Right.
having a reaction to
Sure.
whatever's actually going on. But of course, you're trying to be a fly on the wall.
Of course.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think the way you film it is just hoping that you're documenting something that will like do justice to the person's story.
Yeah.
And um, if you're listening and being quiet and letting things play out, then you can hopefully do that. So that was kind of the goal. Like, there were a few times me and Milos, our sound guy, were just sitting in the corner looking at each other like, whoo,
Yeah.
as we're
Yeah.
trying not to make too much noise. But
Understood. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Wow. What an amazing experience for you too, Sarah. I have to say, no question about it. And just being with this man, like, oh my gosh, like you said, what an inspiration. And I loved his relationship with his family and the beautiful grandchildren, and how Avi and him were so close.
yeah,
I think that's
absolutely.
what moved me the most.
Oh, I love that. That's actually, I always say, my favorite reaction to the movie is when people say that the thing that stood out for them was the grandparent-grandchild connection. And I mean, for me too, like that's the thing for me. So I've been really lucky to be close with all four of my grandparents. And my grandma Millie passed away while we were making this film.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And thank you. And she was my best friend. And
Yeah.
so for
Oh,
me, the story that stands out the most is like family and legacy, and wanting to know your grandparents as people and know
yeah.
their story. And then, like, as you get older, realizing that's your story too. And
Yeah.
so the stuff between Avi and his grandpa is both like the sweetest and the funniest, and just my favorite parts of the movie. That, like, there's an honesty between a grandparent and a grandchild that's different than any
No
other
question.
relationship.
Yeah, I love it. My son, my oldest one, is 30, and he's been going over to my mother and recording her stories. So
That's
I'm
great.
really
You will
happy
all
about that.
treasure that. That's a
Yeah,
gift for all of you. Yeah.
no question, because she writes it out. She doesn't use computers, so she writes it out like, her cursive, and I'm like, I don't have time to transcribe all this. So my Ethan went and he's starting to get her to say it, and I think that that's amazing, because again, these stories need to be told and remembered, no question.
Definitely.
Another great aspect of the film too is meeting Zippy. Wow, what an amazing story she had, and because of her, David survived and everything, and just, oh my God, oh wow, what an incredible woman she was too.
She was. And yeah, they luckily a lot of her interviews have been recorded by the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And just digging into all of that, I mean, she's a fascinating person.
Mhm.
And I mean, a firecracker, like,
Yeah.
just like a cool lady.
Yeah.
And so getting to know her story more was really enlightening for me, of just another, like, again, the thing for her, she was artistic and creative. And then for David, it was music. So another thing that was kind of just interesting to me is, like, all the stuff your parents don't really want you to study or think about too much in college, like music and art and relationships and all that, were like the only things that wound up mattering in
Right.
when life was tough. And David and Sippy both discovered that.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to ask you, Sarah, working so many years on The Daily Show, and you mentioned earlier in our conversation that, dealing with dark, subjects or tough subjects with humor is a way to get them out there, I think. And so I was wondering how you working on The Daily Show kind of helped you with your documentary filmmaking in that aspect.
Yeah. So I was at The Daily Show for 12 years and obviously learned a ton being there. And I worked on 2 feature films while I was there, and I learned a ton. So most of the time I was there, I was in what we called studio. So where the correspondents interview or sorry, the correspondents chat with the host, or where
Right.
the host is just at the desk telling
Yes.
stories. But the first few years I was in the field. So
Yeah.
those are pieces where correspondents go out and interview people. So a lot of my job was doing pre-interviews.
Mhm.
And I learned that just about everyone has a story that they will share if they're asked questions and given the opportunity to answer. And then I also learned a lot about scripting, meaning not scripting things for someone, but that when you're going into the edit, the story needs a beginning, middle, and end, whether it's
Right.
a 5-minute piece or a 90-minute piece. And if something doesn't work on paper, it's not going to make sense to an audience. And so for me, for documentary filmmaking, I want it to be a movie that you're experiencing that's as intriguing as if you were watching a narrative, with the added
Sure.
bonus that it's all true. And I
Yeah.
learned a lot of that at the Daily Show.
Yeah, very cool. What a great experience for you. So I'm sure, you know, your audiences are going to get so much out of this film, and I can't wait for it to be shown here at Hot Docs. And I know you're going to have some great responses. But at the end, you know, like what would you like people to take from it, and what are you hoping? You know, I hope that this film, like, and many more like it, are shown in schools and that kids are educated. But what would you like?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would definitely love as many eyes on it as possible. I think it's really easy to watch stuff and think like that's terrible that that happened then,
Yeah,
there, and separate yourself. But I mean, things are happening now in the
yeah,
world, and you know, looking at Ukraine, looking at many places around the world where people are persecuted, and um, and then even, you know, in our own countries. And I had an experience making the film during the beginning of the Black Lives Matter protests, where I had a pretty sad realization, where I was watching the scene where David and Avi are going into the camps, and Avi asks his grandfather, did everyone know what was happening right outside the gate? And
yeah,
Avi says, yes, of course they knew. Everyone knew, they just didn't want to pay attention. And I was
right.
like, you know what? I've known what's been going on in my own country for years, but I didn't want to look at it.
Yeah,
And so I think we have a lot we can learn if we're open from stories like this one. And my hope is that by telling it with a dose of humor,
mm,
that people are open to hearing it, you know, maybe in a way that they wouldn't be like it. My hope is that if you're someone who's like, this isn't the story for me, know that this one's a little bit different, and that
yeah,
you hopefully will enjoy watching this one, and maybe appeal to people who, a lot of people love learning about history or learning about the Holocaust, but for those who don't, I hope you hear that this is a story that is for you too,
yeah.
and that you can have, it's going to sound crazy, but have fun watching it and enjoy watching it and be moved by it.
I agree. I loved it. I was very pleasantly surprised, because sometimes when I see Holocaust documentary and I'm like, you know, but it was
Right.
wonderful, and you did a fantastic job. And just thank you for bringing us David's story. It really is a story that needs to be seen by everybody. So thank you so much for your time today. And are you coming in to the city for?
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, for some family COVID restriction reasons, I can't travel right now.
Yeah. Oh,
But
well.
I hope people go. And also at the there's 3 screenings, but at the first screening on May 1st, Avi's performing. So if
Wonderful.
anyone wants to
Oh,
get to see him
amazing.
live, please check that
Amazing.
out. So
That's fantastic. What a treat. That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it,
thank
Sarah.
you.
And again,
Take
thank
care.
you for the film. Take
Okay.
care.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye. Be well. Bye-bye.
You too.